Kapow, we're back. Welcome to this week's episode of Live with Littlewood. We've got a great lineup of guests and we've got a huge amount to get our teeth into. Are we finally emerging from lockdown? Our own Independence Day was on the 4th of July where you could go down the pub again. Things even here in Westminster are beginning to reopen. Not every last pub and every last restaurant, but a good few of them. Are we actually putting this crisis behind us? And of course, the Chancellor today, his big package and plans to ensure that the economy bounces back. Well, what do we make of those? If you're in the loft insulation business, it sounds like pretty damn good news for you. That's going to be a major part, this Green New Deal of the Chancellor's recovery. So we're going to be asking Rishi Sunak, is he, after his performance today, is he a saint or is he a sinner? For those of you who are fans of our Chancellor of the Exchequer, you'll know that he has many noble traits. One of the ones I'm fondest of is that he, like me, is a devout supporter of Southampton Football Club, the Saints, so perhaps he is a saint. Or perhaps we think that some of his high-spending interventionist stuff today, although mixed in with some good tax cuts as well, is going to help get Britain's economy moving again and make up the, 25% of GDP that's been wiped off. There's a lot to do and there's a lot to get through, but with our lineup of guests this evening, we're going to solve each and every problem in the next 100 minutes. Later up on the show, we've got Matthew Lesh, the head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. He'll be sharing his thoughts on the Chancellor's statement. The writer, author, and the former research director here at the IEA, Dr. Jamie Whyte. We're joined by our good friends at the TaxPayers Alliance. Duncan Simpson is back on the show. He's the research director over at the TPA. From the home team, our head of political economy at the IEA, Kristian Niemietz, will be joining us. And make sure you stay right to the end of the show because we'll be considering a bit about culture, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, privacy, when we're joined by Silkie Carlo, the director of Big Brother Watch, and Claire Fox, the director of the Academy of Ideas. All of those guys and girls coming up later in the show. But at the top of the show, I'm really delighted to be joined by Isabel Oakeshott, famous political journalist, commentator, all-round good egg. Good evening, Isabel. Lovely to have you back with us. And Andrew Lilico is back on the show, chairman and executive director of Europe Economics and an IEA fellow. Good evening to you, Andrew. Great to have you back.
Good evening.
Brilliant.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Andrew, I'm going to start with you. Can we be confident now? I know you've written about it in the Telegraph earlier this week, and we might share a link to that on the screen. Are we confident now that we are finally emerging from lockdown? Is the end in sight? Is this liberalisation on a trajectory to get us back to normal? Or should we be concerned about a second spike, a second lockdown? Are we getting ahead of ourselves? Do you think there are now grounds for optimism and hope that we're moving in the right direction? And is it a one-way street back to normality? Or am I being a bit too confident there?
Well, I'd say two kinds of things. So first of all, the fact that the pub's open wasn't really the end of lockdown per se. You know, you've still got schools shut and you've got gyms shut, and I can't play squash or go to choir, or and then you've got theatres, you've got all the levies still upset about things. So there's still quite a lot of activities of life that are constricted. But a second thing to say, I think, is that even though we hope some of those things might come back over the next few months, I don't think we should assume that the disease phase of this is by any means over, let alone the economic phase of it, because part of the evidence, if we look around the world, there isn't anywhere in the world at the moment where the disease is spreading at a R greater than 1.2. So essentially what seems to be happening is you've got quite a lot of countries where it's still spreading reasonably rapidly, but they're hot countries or countries currently in the summer. I think that the natural suspicion must be some combination of there are a relatively small number of things that we can do which constrain the spread but don't end it completely, and that it spreads faster in the winter than in the summer, perhaps when we're all indoors and that kind of thing. So at the moment, we might be just in a sweet spot where it's spreading a little bit slower. Maybe come the autumn, if we don't get a vaccine, then maybe we might start to see it spreading faster again. And under those circumstances, a lot of people say, well, it's not possible to have another lockdown. Oh, I think it is. I think that the government might well decide that it needed to lock things down quite a lot. Hopefully, what it would do is to identify the 3 or 4 really key things to restrict the second time. Because, of course, this sort of scatterbomb approach of just banning everything, we always knew that that was banning too many things. So hopefully with a bit of few months learning, we can work out what the few key things are to do. Maybe it'll just be a matter of avoiding public transport, wear a mask, don't shake hands, work from home a bit more often. Maybe that'll be enough, but it might not be.
Isabel, what are your thoughts? Are we on the route back to normality? As Andrew says, you know, not everything's open. You still got to wear a face mask everywhere. I tried to navigate Clapham Junction railway station today. Absolute nightmare. I'd rather walk into work, frankly. But are we step by step getting back to normality, or are you worried that we might trip up on the way?
I mean, we're in a very, very weird place. I mean, you said that you were at Clapham Junction today and it was a nightmare. I actually took the train earlier this week for the first time since March. I'm a commuter normally from the Cotswolds into London Marylebone. I'd forgotten how to use the Trainline app. That's how badly I'd gone down. But I took the train, as I say, for the first time since the lockdown, and I basically had a chauffeur-driven train in both directions. There was not a soul in my carriage or in the carriage next door, and this was at peak time going into London. And you know, I was armed with my mask. There wasn't actually any need to wear it. And equally on the tube, you know, it was a pretty mixed picture. It was very quiet, and only, I wouldn't have said by any means 70% of people were doing what they were told and wearing their masks. And then again on Marylebone High Street, where I had to be, normally a very high-end shopping precinct where you know, you get a very heavy footfall even early on a Monday morning. I would say about a third to half of the shops were closed. So I wonder whether central London is a kind of unique area, and actually the lockdown is having a much more lasting effect in central London than it is elsewhere. I've also been, for various reasons, looking at rental properties, and you know, that has been a complete horror show for that sector. You know, there are empty buildings everywhere. So it's a sort of strange place. And when you listen to the Chancellor's statement today, you know, encouraging us all to go and eat out and, you know, get booking holidays. And then you remember, actually, I'm not sure that technically we're really allowed to be around each other's houses. And, you know, are we even allowed to have like an old-fashioned dinner party? I'm not sure that's within the rules. So you've got a kind of extraordinary mixed messages going on. And no strong political message from the government saying, actually, folks, you can relax a bit. You know, this thing isn't going to get you the minute you leave your home and step across the threshold of a restaurant. So it feels to me as if the economic package from the Chancellor today, which I know we're going to come on to, needs to be accompanied by some rather soothing language from the Department of Health and the Prime Minister himself, which begins to make people realise that the Grim Reaper doesn't lurk immediately outside their home the minute they set foot into fresh air.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what you've suggested there, Isabel, I think also paints a picture, we don't yet know the official numbers, about how bleak levels of economic activity really are. I wonder whether a 25% reduction in GDP is a bit of an understatement, that things might have gone backwards more than that. But let's get on to our topic around Rishi as a saint or a sinner in his package of measures today, and perhaps we'll just sort of go through them. I mean, I think there's bits that free market people might like. There's a stamp duty holiday, although people of my mindset would have preferred a stamp duty abolition rather than a mere holiday. Then we've got this kind of Green Deal thing, which is sort of presented as a win-win job creation scheme that people will be given vouchers if they want their loft insulated. I haven't checked whether I haven't got a loft, but if I can get some boiler lagging free from the government, I guess I'll sign up for that. And then we've got this sort of VAT cut on the hospitality sector, and the Chancellor's apparent determination to try and prove that there is such a thing as a free lunch, right? If you buy your Boris burger or your Sunak spaghetti for less than a tenner, you basically have it on the house if you're treating the taxpayer as the house. So, Isabel, what was your view of the mix of measures put forward? A mixed bag or better than that?
Well, look, I don't want to disappoint you about the Green Deal, but do you actually remember the Green Deal under the Conservatives at the beginning of the coalition? Sorry, I'm just going to have to stop for a second because that weird noise you hear in the background is my dog bleating to be let out. Hold on 1 second.
Well, Andrew, maybe I can throw over to you on... and we'll come back to Isabel when she sort out... Oh, no, look, she was incredibly efficient at sorting out her canine problems. If only we had that level of efficiency in the public sector.
That's how I roll. Yes, I mean, the Green Deal, at the beginning of the years of the coalition, I actually fell for this con, and I had some guy come round and, you know, there was all this marketing about how you could get thousands of pounds worth of insulation. I just say, don't bother. The small print never, ever makes it worth it. So I think that's probably never going to end up being what it's cracked up to be. I mean, a huge raft of measures. That the stamp duty thing sounds on the face of it very attractive, but how many people are really going to rush out and buy a home that they otherwise wouldn't have done at such an uncertain time? So I think it's well intentioned. As you say, we'd rather see the end of stamp duty perpetually rather than a temporary thing. As for the eating out thing, I mean, again, it sounds attractive, but I just come back to this whole issue of the lack of kind of reassurance from the government about how worried we should be on this thing. I mean, we've still got children. My children today had some form of school, but where did this school take place? It took place in a bloody field where they had to sit in the rain with their jackets on. You know, I mean, this is utterly ridiculous. And you, at the same time as saying we can't educate your children, they've got to meet in a field for a picnic. I don't think any education really went on. They're saying, well, you know, but please go to a restaurant. It just doesn't quite stack up to me.
Andrew, what's your take? Saint or sinner, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, what's your view of this overall package of measures? What should free market types like you and I make of this?
Well, first of all, I agree with Isabel that the Green Deal looks very much like a retread of an old policy. The ones that kind of interest me are the job scheme and the restaurants. The Thank Rishi It's Wednesday scheme there. On the jobs, I'm a little bit mystified because normally governments would intervene in the economy with job creation or job support schemes if economies were poor at creating or sustaining jobs, if unemployment were high and stubbornly coming down or unemployment going up. The UK economy has been a job creating machine for 25 years, even in the Great Recession, 2008-09, GDP down more than any time since the 1920s. Unemployment still only didn't go much above 8%. By early this year, it was down at well below 4%, lowest for over 40 years. The only reason, of course, it's true that lots of people have some enforced idleness at the moment, but that's because the government insisted that they weren't allowed to go and do their jobs. It banned them from going to do their jobs. And just in case the economy would have provided any alternative employment for them, it then paid their employers to carry on employing them at 80% of their salary with the furlough scheme. I don't know why the government assumes that that there wouldn't be new jobs that the economy itself would create for these people. The economy seems to have been a bit maligned, a bit insulted that the government sort of decided that it wasn't going to be able to create any jobs for them without the economy ever getting a chance to do so. So I don't really know what that scheme is. Maybe it's some sort of way of the government signalling that it's going to do too much too early, and this because they think it's helpful as a support signal. But I don't know what economic effect it's really supposed to have beyond that. As for this, latter day British restaurants kind of thing, where we have half of that, I'm again a bit unclear what that is. My best go at saving that as an idea is perhaps the thought is if you subsidize Monday to Wednesday eating, then you can spread out the restaurant eating over the week, which makes the social distancing a little bit easier. Because otherwise, maybe with the economic pressures, maybe some restaurants would shut Monday to Wednesday, or people would tend to go at the weekend, and it would be harder to get in because everything would be a bit more crowded. So if you can spread them out across the week, maybe there's some wisdom in that. Maybe even keep a few extra firms going so that you spread things out from the social distancing point of view. But if that's really the scheme, well, at the moment, he's only announced it going for a month. I mean, presumably that would be an arrangement you would have for quite a long time, for as long as the coronavirus crisis lasts. So I'm not really clear what these things are about. If it's just a scheme to encourage us to go on slightly different days, then it's probably a bit more expensive than it needs to be. But that principle isn't probably an entirely stupid one.
But hang on a second, Andrew. I mean, this shows how far free market liberalism has fallen. We're now going to centrally plan when people eat curry because too many of us are trying to do so on a Friday and a Saturday and not enough on a Tuesday and a Wednesday. I mean, the market can take care of that, right? I mean, restaurants often have offers for Mondays and Tuesdays, and it's harder to get in on Fridays or Saturdays. Why on earth do we need a minister of restaurants to plan that sort of stuff for us?
As I said, that's my best go at giving an excuse for what otherwise seems to be a broadly indefensible scheme. It's quite incomprehensible why they would want to subsidize going out to restaurants in this way. Not least, again, because, I mean, the only reason people haven't been not going to restaurants because they've been feeling the pinch or something. They've been not going to restaurants because a combination of the government banning them and them not wanting to go and spread the disease. If it's all right for them to go to restaurants and spread the disease now, well, why doesn't the government just say that? It doesn't need to it's a bit weird for the government to say, don't go out and go with other people and spread the disease around, but we're going to subsidize you to do so. That's kind of a weird combination. My best go at rescuing it is this idea of trying to smooth things across the week. Though, as you point out, maybe that's a bit desperate. I'm too gentle.
No, you've been far too generous to him. It seems like you were leaning towards the saint side, but thanks for the clarification, Andrew. Isabel, let me come back to you, and I'd like your thoughts on the kind of furlough scheme, because as an historian really of the Brexit process, we got in for years and years and years the can being kicked down the road on Brexit, and I'm a bit worried we're just kicking the can down the road on the economic impact of coronavirus. So we bring in the furlough scheme to try and kind of calcify each and every job, make sure nobody's made unemployed, no business goes bust. And now we're sort of saying, well, that's going to wind down by October, for crying out loud. You can still furlough people to October. And now you'll have a £1,000 bonus if you keep any of your furloughed staff on until January next year. This seems to be a kind of can kicking, does it not, Isabel? And is kind of removing the creative destruction of capitalism. I mean, what I would like is just simply for it to be a lot easier to reallocate workers to new businesses rather than failing businesses, rather than trying to preserve each and every business, restaurant and job that presently exists. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it comes down to, when do you want your crash? You're arguing that you'd rather just get it over and done with quickly. If you're Rishi Sunak, you try and string this out for as long as possible until you're out of number 11, and your incredible meteoric rise isn't spoilt by the horrible reality of what is to come. And you say about the furlough scheme only going on till the end of October. But now we heard today that we've got this bonus for employers who bring their workers back until at least the end of January. I think that's going to be very attractive to many employers in the key sectors that are affected. After all, that's going to be the Christmas season. Bloody well hope by then that we're all able to actually go to restaurants and not have to wear masks everywhere and so on. So in a way, the can has been kicked down till at least early next year. I think there's a real issue with making going out actually an appealing prospect. And we're seeing a lot of businesses, I'm thinking particularly in the supermarket sector, kind of gold plating the government's regulations or guidance. So, I mean, I'm struck by the extent to which supermarkets are still insisting on 2 meters between customers. And where I live, There's a regular, miserable long queue at the moment out in the rain all down the street to go into the co-ops, utterly unnecessary. And it has got to the point where I've basically given up going there. So the kind of discretionary shopping people are just not going to do if it becomes so unpleasant an experience and you're wasting so much time. And all that time spent endlessly queuing has a knock-on effect to the economy in many different ways. And then there was another shop I went into this week. I walked through the door and they said, "Can you sanitize, please?" And I just walked right out, not because I didn't know that all they meant was rubbing my hands with hand gel, but I just thought that's no way to greet your customers. So I think that there are so many different approaches here, and simply throwing money at the problem isn't going to solve it if you don't also tackle this over interpretation of guidelines.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on what Isabel's said there? That it's, I mean, folk like you and I, and Isabel too, will obviously be looking at the levers that politicians can pull economically. But have we sort of got ourselves into, you know, I mean, I hate the phrase the new normal because there's absolutely nothing normal about what's going on. But is there almost a problem with a cultural mindset now that it's going to be almost impossible to ever get back to, you know, slapping somebody on the back down the pub, or giving someone a hug, or, you know, being within 6 foot of someone when you go and do your grocery shopping? Have we almost over-adapted? I can remember when you were on the show a few weeks ago, Andrew, you were saying how incredible it was, how swiftly, particularly the private sector, had adapted to this challenge. But does that sort of psychologically put us in a completely different mindset, and we'll never go back to, you know, brushing past each other on the street or in a supermarket queue again? Is that holding us back as much as the economic levers and problems that we face?
Well, a couple of things. I guess I might be a bit less harsh than Isabel on the decisions that different supermarkets or shops or whatever make. Now, I guess it's up to them if they don't want Isabel to go, but they might be more interested in other people who would be more nervous or would feel that they had quite a high duty to avoid spreading the disease. So the individual shops have to make their decisions. I think that she's right that will deter certain people from shopping, but I think that there's already quite a lot going on in the way of people switching to online shopping. Enormous amounts of companies like Amazon and so on are ordering. So that, I think, is something which is going to happen. In terms of the other features, I think it is plausible that we will never quite go back to lovey kisses, and maybe even if we shake hands, we'll be a bit further apart, or we'll wipe our hands afterwards or something like that. So there could be some quite enduring cultural implications of all of these things. I think one of the key things, though, is that we want to find, I don't think the right aspiration is that we should change nothing. What we want to find is the smallest and least cumbersome set of things that to change that can make the key difference if we have to live with this thing for some time. And that's why, I mean, I know that some people get very upset about things like suggestions that people should wear masks on public transport. But if it's a choice between us being sufficiently compliant that we wear masks on public transport, that there's relatively little spread, and the government every few months banning rugby or closing down the schools or whatever, it seems to me that the burden of just a little bit of staying a bit further apart and wearing masks and things like that is very low compared with the burden of these other things. And even if you don't think that the disease is severe enough to justify doing those things, the government definitely does. And the reality is that the burdens on us all are going to be much larger if we cannot find and then comply with a narrow set of measures. And that seems to me to be the right aspiration from here.
Okay, Andrew, Isabel, stay with us, but I've got 2 more guests to introduce to tackle this Sunak's saint or sinner question and to give their thoughts on the Chancellor's statement today. Really pleased to welcome back Matt Lesh, the head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. Fantastic to have him back on the show. A very, very good evening to you, Matt. And really pleased to be joined by my good friend Jamie Whyte, writer, author, former research director here, former leader of the ACT Party over in New Zealand. Good evening, Jamie. Great to have you with us.
Good evening.
Matt, let me start with you. Blimey, Jamie, your glass looked a bit empty there. You need a refill, I think.
It's vodka, lime and soda. It's for the weight.
Okay. I thought it was just cloudy water. You put my mind to rest that it's vodka, lime and soda. That's much sounder. Matt, let me start with you. The Adam Smith Institute, your Adam Smith Institute released a report recently looking at how we could unfreeze the economy, unleash British enterprise, prepare for a kind of free market bounce back from this disastrous period. How much has your advice as Chancellor Sunak taken?
Well, I think there's a few very welcome elements. I think that the general tone in terms of seeing it as a private sector-led growth of the economy, despite all this rhetoric about FDR, we aren't seeing silly things like make work programs and just employing people for the sake of employing people. But for me, in terms of the specifics on the announcements, I think it was probably the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think the good were the stamp duty cuts. Is a pernicious tax. It penalizes people moving. We know it's extremely economically damaging. It's good to see the threshold rise to 500,000. Obviously, we'd like to see it abolished altogether, but I think it's a very good start. I think the bad was the traineeships and the job subsidies. It's not clear to me that that's actually going to create meaningful private sector jobs. I think then Chuckleton from the IEA and Buckingham had a very good article in CapEx today making the point that the research on these is not particularly promising, which I think is sad, but it seems like a lot of it ends up being people who are displaced from other jobs or people who will be employed anyway. So it doesn't necessarily create sustainable long-term jobs for young people as much as we might want it to. I think this ugly was the VAT cuts and these restaurant discounts. It's not clear to me that that's the right policy at the moment. It's going to be extremely expensive. It's going to be quite easily gained. I think it's going to be quite a messy policy. If the problem is that people are too scared to go dine, restaurants can't accommodate as many people, it's not necessarily clear to me that we've got a demand-driven problem here, but we've got a kind of Keynesian-style stimulus response, which I think is going to be quite counterproductive.
So where are you on the saint versus sinner question, Matt, for Rishi Sunak? A little bit of sainthood, but no beatification just yet?
He's not. I mean, it could always be worse. I wouldn't say saint or sinner just yet. I think there's a lot more to see with Sunak. I think the budget will tell us quite a lot as well in terms of his actual kind of longer term direction. There's good as always with these kind of announcements. There's good and bad elements to them. It's a very weak response, I feel.
just before I come to Jamie, though, we were speaking at the top of the show about the stamp duty cut, and far be it from me to ever criticise a cut. I mean, Isabel and I were just saying maybe they should have gone for full abolition rather than just a step in this direction. But Matt, let me put it to you, because you were hailing the stamp duty cut from the live chat on YouTube. Estate agents report that June was actually a record month for property sales. So, I mean, don't we, is this really the medicine that's needed if the property market hasn't actually frozen up? Perhaps he should have used whatever ammunition he had for tax cuts elsewhere, or do you think stamp duty is the one to go for?
Well, I think June was a record month also in contrast to just how terrible the previous months were. So there's probably a bit of kind of pent-up transactions that were delayed into June. So it's not clear to me that the market is all right. I think there's a lot of danger, and the CPS had a good report out on this, that whilst construction work was getting started again on existing projects, there weren't new projects in the pipeline. And I think this could potentially provide some benefit to get people being willing to sell, being willing to transact, being willing to construct, combined with, I think, actually probably the more important forthcoming build planning reforms that will really get Britain moving and Britain building. But I think considering the fact that stamp duty is just such a bad tax, and it's it causes, in economic terms, it causes huge dead weight loss, fewer transactions. We want transactions. We shouldn't tax transactions. I think getting rid of stamp duty is, or at least reducing it, is something very welcome. And I'm glad he did it. I was disappointed, though, in terms of other tax cuts by the lack of attention to employers' national insurance. I would have much preferred a broad-based reduction in the cost of hiring people rather than these kind of trainee programs that I don't think are going to be particularly effective.
Jamie, let me come to you, and I want your thoughts on this kind of supposed win-win with environmentalism, job creation. Let's have the government pay for 650,000 homes to have loft insulation. What could possibly go wrong? It's win-win-win. It will support 140,000 green jobs. I mean, I tear my hair out when I hear this sort of stuff. I mean, you might as well say, let's have an ice cream-led recovery by giving everybody 100 quid's worth of Ben and Jerry vouchers. I mean, it's completely absurd, isn't it? And I mean, at least on an economic case. I mean, if you want everybody's loft insulated to save us from climate change, that's one thing. But the idea that this is sensible economics, you agree with me, don't you? It's madness.
Well, of course I agree with you. I mean, you used to employ me. the fact that they're not happening already, these transactions, right, without being subsidized, suggests that people don't think they're worth the money. So then the government comes along and says, well, subsidize it, and now you'll do it. And that's a good thing, right? Well, by definition, it's a bad thing because we've already agreed that it's not worth the money. Now, I guess what they want jobs to be created. They're trying to stimulate demand. So they could just give people money, right? But if they just gave people money, they might not spend it. That's the first thing. So they prefer vouchers. So effectively, they're giving you a voucher to get home insulation. They're giving you a voucher to go to a restaurant. You can't get your hands on the money without spending it. And also, you get to spend it. You have to spend it in a particular way. And for various political reasons, I guess, they fancy, anything you put the word green on nowadays is good. And there's been a lot of attention paid for some reason to restaurants and that kind of thing. And so it's newsworthy. And I think they're just being led by politics. I mean, I was going to say what Matthew said, actually, was on unemployment, which is that it would have been better to get rid of the employer's NI contribution. But I really want to make a broader point, of which that's an example, which is that modern politicians, especially this bunch, are very bold in one respect, which they're willing to spend enormous sums of money. They're not shy about that. But they are very, very nervous, it seems, about making any serious structural changes in the tax code. For example, they could have, I think we should abolish corporation tax. That's one of my more radical policy views, but as one, now, they're not going to do it. I think they should lower it much further, because if you're trying to, the problem really is going to be investment rather than consumption, I think. And, high corporate taxes deter investment, but without going into the details, I don't really want to go into the details. It's just they do all these silly fiddly little things, the restaurant stuff, temporary lifting of the threshold for this tax and temporary diminishing the rate of that one. It's all fiddling. I wish they'd taken the opportunity to make some serious structural changes, because the British tax code, for example, is just a mess.
And it's obviously become ever more complicated today. I mean, 5% VAT on hospitality. I mean, I don't know what that includes. I'm now due to renew my Southampton FC season ticket. I assume that's now VAT at 5% if I renew it in time rather than 20%. I mean, it comes with a burger and some beers. Maybe I could even get 10 quid for the burger, right? I mean, it's incredibly fiddly and complicated. But Jamie, I wanted to press you on one thing, and then I'll bring Isabel and Andrew back in. That you were sort of having a bit of a pop at restaurants there, Jamie, but you can sort of understand a bit that if certain sectors of the economy have been disproportionately hit by the lockdown, you want to give a certain boost to that side of it. And given that it's basically been near as damn it illegal to run a pub or a restaurant for 3 or 4 months, those businesses have been hit. So you can see why you might want to target assistance on sectors. It's not obvious to me that the loft insulation industry should be a worthy recipient of however many billions of pounds it is. But do you think there is a case for saying, well, because of the rules, this sector was particularly hurt, it might even be a region that was particularly hurt, so we'll provide special assistance? Or do you think the right approach is just, across the board, we're going to cut red tape, reduce business rates, reduce income tax, scrap NICs, or whatever else it might be, Jamie?
Well, I'll answer the other way around. I think there was always a case for doing the things you just suggested, even before coronavirus came along. So I would be in favor of that. Now, I do understand that if the lockdown had a terrible effect on some industries rather than others. Restaurants is a classic example. Theatres is another example. Of course, they would have been hit even if there hadn't been a lockdown. So people wouldn't go to the theatre if they're going to be crowded in. There would have been, so the virus itself would have had a lot of the different impact on the different industries would have been achieved by the virus itself. It wouldn't be as strong. So I wish they hadn't had a lockdown. I'm one of those crazy people. I think there shouldn't have been a lockdown. I think we should have done the Swedish way, where people voluntarily socially distance and they make these decisions for themselves, then there would be no rationale for bailing out the restaurants, because viruses come along from time to time. That's an inherent risk in the restaurant business. You should be capitalized for, insured for it, or whatever it need be, and the government's got no obligation to bail you out. Unfortunately, the government did intervene, and it now kind of does. I mean, if I were a restaurateur, I would feel, you screwed me, you got to bail me out. Alas, this is what you get with government intervention. One government intervention always requires more to fix the problem that they created. And we have a government now, a conservative government, many of them apparently friends of the IEA, kind of people who've come and talked with us, who never say a free market word. You don't hear a free market word coming out of this government. They never say things like, people are very dynamic, we have a nice, good economy, we'll bounce back strong, we don't need government intervention. Mm-hmm. You never hear that. They're our saviors. They're completely left-wing.
Thanks for cheering me up there, Jamie. I want to go back to Isabel, who had, well, maybe not quite as dim a view, but a pretty dim view of the government. Isabel, what I want to ask you is, what would you have liked to have seen Chancellor Sunak? I love the name Chancellor Sunak. It makes him sound like a character from Star Wars. It's just an absolutely brilliant name. But what would you have liked to have seen him do that he didn't do, and might you be holding in reserve on the top of your wish list, Isabel, for what he might do in the budget? You know, what do you think? And within the realm of political feasibility, what sort of lever are you imploring Rishi to pull that he failed to pull today?
Well, I mean, I would agree with Jamie about corporation tax. That's always a very good place to start, and particularly as we position ourselves for the end of the transition period. You know, I'm one of these that wants to see us becoming a kind of, you know, Singapore on steroids. That now seems a very distant dream. Amazingly, you know, just how much things have changed in the last few months. So I would like us to be as low tax as we can be. And unfortunately, I suspect we're heading in precisely the opposite direction. As the government tries to find a way to pay for all of these schemes. I think you're probably being a little bit uncharitable when you say it's all too small and too fiddly. I think you've got to kind of put this against, you know, if you look back on any recent budget, this just looks like the most incredibly exciting package of measures that we've had for ages. Now, I have to make a point, all things being relative, you know, most of our budgets are very, very dull, and you know, they're much more tinkering in a very, very minor way than this has been. So you know, I don't think we should be too mean and say this isn't at all bold, but you do wonder how much the cost of administering some of these schemes are going to be, and whether that is going to offset any gain. So you know, I don't want to be too down on it, but of course I want to see much more radical tax cutting, corporation tax and so on.
But administrative costs are good, right? Because they create jobs.
Well, so the claim goes. So the claim goes. Andrew, I know you can only stay with us for a few more minutes, but what's at the top of the Lilico wish list that could feasibly have been done by Rishi Sunak today, but might still be, you know, in his top pocket for a later announcement or the budget? If you were sat down in number 11 with him now, what would be your sort of top one or two ideas that he could feasibly introduce in the weeks ahead?
So I think one of the biggest issues, not just for a budget, but for the whole economy, is commercial rents. So we've had loads of firms have had an extended period when they've been effectively banned by the government from using their commercial office space and their pubs and all kinds of other things. So and they've not been paying; they've been being charged. And so whereas normally you have something like 10% of firms are behind on their rents, at the moment it's somewhere between 40 and 50% of firms are behind on their commercial rents. So there's just an enormous backlog. And one of the things that's going to happen is that as the economy starts to normalize again, and people then the commercial landlords are going to be charging for those rents. And I think that there must be quite a strong case for some form of burden sharing, because otherwise you're going to have enormous numbers of businesses that are going to go bankrupt. and you're going to also have lots of them are going to try to appeal or claim that they shouldn't be paying the rent, so the courts are going to get bogged down for years. Why should it be that under this kind of scenario, the commercial landlords are completely shielded from the consequences, whilst the commercial tenants are completely exposed? It doesn't seem to me to make any sense. I would have thought some kind of burden sharing measure, setting things out, would be something the government should consider.
And Andrew, before I let you go, and I'll ask Isabel this next, as you know, on every episode of this show, we ask everybody their optimism rating. We're asking you what your optimism is for the United Kingdom over the next 2 to 3 years. That's the timescale we're looking at. And, you know, are you optimistic about in 2 or 3 years' time us being a thriving free market, low tax, deregulated, Isabel Oakeshott style Singapore on steroids economy? Or that would be a 10. Or are you, we're on the path to being North Korea, that would be a 0. Last time you were on the show, Andrew, I think you gave us a 2, saying that nuclear holocaust would be a 1. Are you any more optimistic this time? What's your number out of 10?
Maybe 3, marginally up. So the contraction in GDP that we've had is worse than many a small war that took place on your own territory. So the level of the damage that we've had already is larger than a small war. My marginally increased optimism is based on they seem to be doing slightly better with some of the therapies. So it might be that the chances of some kind of earlier resolution are slightly higher than they were. So maybe I'll go from a 2 to a 2.5, and we'll round that up to a 3, just to make you just get a smile on your face.
Just 3, that's cheered me up. So if we invite you on for another 7 shows, we'll get you up to a 10, Andrew. And Isabel, tell us, give us your outlook. Are you going to be as miserable and downcast as Andrew there, or are you a bit more upbeat? If we don't get Singapore on steroids, might we get something that vaguely approaches that?
No, I don't think so. I'm a bit gloomier actually than I was last time I came on, mainly because I actually think that Rishi Sunak, under other circumstances, would probably have been one of our best hopes of Singapore on steroids. But in 3 years' time, I suspect it's very unlikely that he is in the Treasury anymore. I don't know where he will have been moved to. He's becoming an increasing threat, I think, to Boris Johnson. At the moment, there's no sign of that dynamic being anything other than pretty healthy and positive. But I have to say, if Rishi's poll ratings continue the way they are, he's going to find himself edged out if he's not careful as too much of a threat. So once he has gone, and under these new circumstances that we've now got because of the virus, I'm afraid that we may well be heading towards a Labour administration at the next election. Long way off, but that's hardly going to head us in the direction that I want on low tax and Singapore on steroids.
Got to force you to give me a number, Isabel, and it needs to be an integer between 1 and 10, or 0 and 10.
It's 4.
4? Okay,
yeah.
Edging in the modestly right direction compared to Andrew, but a bit more downcast than last time. Isabel and Andrew, it's been a pleasure having you with us. Thank you very much for giving up a chunk of your evening. Look forward to welcoming you back soon. Next time round, I hope I've cheered you up a bit more, and we might even get you as high as a 5. But it's been great to hear your analysis and to have you on the show. Thank you both. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Great.
Let me just tell you what we've got coming up later on. Jamie and Matt, please stay with us. A whole range of new guests coming up throughout the show. Very shortly, we'll be welcoming Duncan Simpson from the Taxpayers Alliance. Our very own Dr. Kristian Niemietz will be joining us as well. And then at the end of the show, so make sure you stay tuned right the way through to about 7 o'clock onwards, we'll be joined by Silkie, Carlo of Big Brother Watch and Claire Fox of the Institute of Ideas. So many more, and we'll see whether they're more or less pessimistic than our guests so far. I haven't pressed Jamie or Matt yet for their numbers, but we're now joined by Duncan Simpson of the Taxpayers Alliance. Good evening, Duncan. It's great to have you back on the programme.
Hi there, Mark.
Hope you're keeping well. And our very own Kristian Niemietz. Kristian, great to have you with us. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Great to be back.
Duncan, let me start with you. I asked Matt for his take on Rishi Sunak's statement from the ASI's perspective? From the Taxpayers Alliance perspective, are you punching the air with unalloyed glee, or do you have your head in your hands with total despair, or is it somewhere in the middle? What would you say of Rishi Sunak? Is he, from the Taxpayers Alliance point of view, a saint or a sinner after his announcements today?
Well, I don't think it's complete despair, but the head is moving towards being in the hands. I think really echoing quite a few of the points which have been said previously. I mean, I think it's good news what's been said about stamp duty. It does beg the question why this couldn't be done sooner, or why indeed it couldn't be even higher threshold, or indeed eventually abolished entirely. Yes, indeed there have been quite a big increase in house sales last month, but we do know that quite a few banks and building societies are being quite deliberate with, for quite obvious reasons, not offering mortgages to those who are now furloughed, and obviously that situation will continue for some months. So, I mean, there's glimpse of good news for that. But on the other side, I mean, there's some very curious wheezes. I mean, this eat out scheme is, I think, quite pernicious actually, because I think it would almost certainly open up quite a few other rationales for firms which aren't affected by this to do similar kind of special pleading. Now, obviously, we have this quite grandiose art scheme rescue package, I suppose, which was announced last week, about £1.5 billion. About half of that is through grants. But my concern is that, aside from the obvious absurdity of these commissars in DEFRA deciding, well, under Minister for Meals now, and sort of dishing out these vouchers on an apparently unlimited basis, although not including alcohol, I think there's a real concern that you'll see more of this sort of corporatist pleading come along down the line. So there's that. I mean, mild silver lining is that some of the other measures which were incorporated today in the documents were announced last week by Boris, so some of the infrastructure spending as well. So the headline figure's big, but digging through some of the details, not as dangerous as it could be. On the other hand, if you look at some of the small print as well, it's again a bit worrying in terms of we're not quite sure in terms of the total cost of this, because necessarily it's on the basis of uptake. So basically, the Treasury's plans at the moment seem a little bit sketchy. So thumbs up for stamp duty, but quite a few other measures we're quite worried about.
Kristian, you're in the fine IEA tradition of being highly cynical about the capacities, intentions and behaviours of politicians of all stripes. But what do you make of today? I mean, this doesn't seem to be a particularly free market response to the challenges before us, right?
No, it isn't. I agree with Simpson. If anything, I'm even more pessimistic than him. I mean, I was very much in favor of the initial set of measures that was brought in March, because the good thing about that was that those were broad-based horizontal measures. They did not differentiate between different sectors. They applied across the board to the economy as a whole, so at least they were not distortionary. Now they're singling out specific sectors for specific policies. We now have a policy for this sector, a policy for that sector, a policy for this group in the labor market, a policy for that group. And this means it's getting a lot more interventionist and fiddly. This creates room for interest group policies, for lobbying, for gaming the system. And also this means it makes it a lot harder to unwind those schemes again, because now you're creating concentrated interests. The reason why I'm saying I'm a bit more pessimistic than Duncan is that I agree with everything he said, except on the stamp duty. I mean, stamp duty, of course, is a terrible tax. I've always been opposed to stamp duty, but the thing about stamp duty is that it makes the housing market less efficient. It leads to a less efficient allocation of the housing stock by reducing mobility. Now, that isn't something that you can solve by through a holiday of stamp duty. That can only be solved by abolishing it permanently. So the reason why I'm saying a temporary measure here isn't going to cut it, isn't that I want to be excessively purist here. This is not about making the perfect the enemy of the good. It's just that that can only help if it is a long-term measure, and it isn't.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to look. I've got to try and. Usually, I invite my guests on to try and cheer me up. You're not doing a very goddamn good job of that, guys. So let me try and bring some cheer. And I wonder whether there's something completely out of left field that might be of use here. And Jamie, I'm going to come back to you, and then I'm going to ask Matt's thoughts on this. and this is our approach to Hong Kong and China, right? I'd be interested in your thoughts on both, but the China thing makes me a bit worried. I mean, I think they've got one hell of a lot to answer for, but nevertheless, I'm not really sure I want to see sort of global free trade drying up. But the Hong Kong stuff, well, this makes me hugely optimistic, basically. I mean, I'm wondering whether, for all of the sort of fiddly policies and the rest of it, by the back door, we're about to have, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or 1 million plus brilliantly entrepreneurial, highly intelligent, hard-working Hong Kong citizens about to descend on British soil. I mean, that might be exactly what we need to bounce back from this lockdown and coronavirus epidemic, right? I know the two are not linked causally, but it might just be that serendipity gets us out of this. What do you make, Jamie, especially with your antecedents from the other side of the globe, of what's happening in terms of the Western relationship with China, but very specifically the UK government's approach to Hong Kong, and quite possibly the most liberal immigration policy we could have dreamt of, isn't it?
Well, I was very pleased by the government's response and saying, you're welcome to come. One of the few things I've been, pleased by, and I agree with you that they would be generally beneficial. Of course, the complaint that a lot in my native New Zealand, there's a lot of hostility to Chinese immigration on the grounds that they drive up property prices. And of course, the reason they drive up property prices is because they don't drive up the price of haircuts, right? Because the supply of barbers increases, but they do drive up the property prices because in New Zealand, just like Britain, it's almost impossible to build new housing. So that's the only downside I see of it, is that they'll exacerbate this kind of, there's a kind of, well, property prices may go up and you get the kind of political reaction that we got in New Zealand, which, by the way, I don't know if you've followed this, but it's now illegal for foreigners to buy a certain kind of land in New Zealand. This is one of the caring and beautiful social justice things that Jacinda Ardern did. And I agree also that the Chinese government is hard to like. And I fear that anti-trade sentiments that are very strong in the United States, obviously, are being just backed by this hostility towards China. And that it'll have a bad effect on global trade, and it'll seem to justify the anti-trade agenda that was being followed anyway. By the way, I mean, it's a bogus justification, because before these things became issues, the genocide of the Uyghurs and so on, there was already a move against free trade around the world. But I'll just say one final thing, because I know you're tight for time, and backing up Kristian here. Free movement of people is actually more economically important than free trade. So at the moment, we have a relatively, the WTO tariffs aren't that high on most things. If they were reduced, if everyone went to zero, that, I think the best estimates are it would add something like 2% to global GDP. It's not a huge deal at a global level. Free movement of people would have a much, much bigger effect on global GDP. So, I'm more worried about anti-globalization on a movement of people basis than on a movement of goods. And America, they just bloody Trump abolished that visa for smart people, what is it called, the H1. There are lots of terrible things going on this front. And China hysteria isn't going to help.
Matt, let me come back to you on your thoughts on this. Your former colleague at the Adam Smith Institute, Sam Bowman, was sort of, if he'd given up on Singapore on steroids, he sure as hell hadn't given up on Hong Kong 2.0. His plan was to kind of reconstruct the entirety of Hong Kong, I don't know, on the outskirts of Grimsby or something, and bring them all over. Are you at the ASI punching the air about what's happening here? I mean, obviously the clampdown in Hong Kong's nothing to applaud, but in terms of Britain's approach here, this is a liberal immigration policy that could be a real shot in the arm, could it not?
Absolutely. And in the Milton Friedman's kind of famous Free to Choose documentaries, there's a moment where he goes to Hong Kong and he shows this entrepreneurial spirit of a people, of a country that really went from a fishing village to a global economic powerhouse because of the liberal democratic freedoms that had been provided by British colonial rule. And I think what's going on there now is truly tragic. And in terms of the fact that basically the end of the one country, two systems model that China had committed to, and the fact that now Britain is coming in and doing her duty by Hong Kong by providing this path to citizenship, this 5 years visa that can then be converted into citizenship, I think is extremely good news for the people of Hong Kong. It's symbolically important because it shows that, no, we're not going to let China get away with what they're doing. And it's meaningfully in our own self-interest because we know that these are some of the most entrepreneurial, capable, active people. There's an ASI paper, I think in 1989, that first proposed by Douglas Mason, that first proposed putting a Hong Kong 2.0 somewhere in a Scottish island. Sadly, it never quite came to fruition, but it kind of shows this sense in which these are the people we want to have. Ultimately, we're going to be a bit of competition for them, we should remember. They do have the right to go into Taiwan. Australia's talking about providing working visas as well. So we're going to have to show that Britain is the place to come where you can restart what you had in Hong Kong in a land of plenty, in fact, a much bigger land, physically speaking, and be quite prosperous. I do share your worries, Mark, though, about this broader narrative about trade. We shouldn't forget the trade. Even with China, even with all the moral questions that raises about doing business with an authoritarian country, has, as a pure utilitarian good, lifted 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 20 to 30 years. Just a relatively minor opening up of markets has been seen one of the biggest growths in human prosperity in our history, if I would think. And when we turn away from trade and we turn away from the market system that has given us so much, I think we become much poorer. Now, there are some serious issues to talk about when it comes to supply chain diversity, talk about strategic issues, certain goods you need to stock in emergencies. I'm over time, I've as someone who is a free trade purist, I've come to accept the sense in which there might be some specific, meaningful things we need to do to make sure that the trade system functions properly. But overall, we need to keep the mantra that tariffs are a pernicious evil. Reducing trade will make us a lot poorer. Trade reduces consumer prices. It reduces the prices of production inputs. It makes us innovative. It provides a real spark to humanity that we don't want to lose.
Sure. But it's, I bow to virtually nobody other than perhaps you, Matt, on my own free trade purism. But there's a few difficult things to unravel here, isn't it? I mean, isn't the unfolding nature of this crisis going to make the Huawei decision over 5G, that's going to have to be walked back, isn't it? So it's not just a question of whether we should trade with China, it's how kind of intimate our relationships are. I mean, that quite a lot of security concerns, I'm not a security expert, were raised about that beforehand, and now because of other events are likely to be the ace of trumps. Would you think not?
Yeah, so I think there is a positive story about trade through this crisis, which is we've managed to keep the supermarkets' shelves filled. We've managed to continue getting goods and pharmaceuticals, and basically, actually, the global trade system is working quite effectively. That's because we have this diversity of sources. There were certain points where some countries weren't supplying as much to the global system, but we were able to find other things, and it worked quite well. But you're at the right time. I think there's probably three considerations. One is that supply chain diversity, and I think companies can do a lot of this themselves. They're coming to appreciate that, well, if Wuhan shuts down, or one province in China shuts down, for whatever reason, somewhere in the world something happens, you need to have sources of goods from multiple places. And I don't think the government actually needs to intervene because businesses are going to make sure that their supply chains are secure. The second one is the strategic question, which is this difficult question of how dependent you want to be on China. So the Henry Jackson Society did an interesting report about how, for example, China manufactures 95% of the UK's pharmaceutical component drugs. And they identified 229 types of goods that over 50% are imported from China. Now, the extent to which you don't want to have an authoritarian country doesn't show your values and seeks to use trade for political purposes, being able to put that over you. And I say that looking from the recent Australian experience, which is China has chosen to punish Australia for some of their more forthright comments about the COVID crisis. So what they've done is banned imports from two of Australia's biggest arbiters. They've put huge tariffs on barley. They're telling Chinese people that Australians are a bunch of racists, which is a bit rich from a country that literally doesn't let black people into restaurants in some provinces and also locks up Uyghurs in concentration camps. But in any case, it shows this danger of doing business with China and becoming excessively dependent on China. But I think we've got to remember, well, China's dependent on us. There's no doubt some policy think tank or group in China that's having this exact discussion. Are we too dependent on the West? You could limit our access to goods. I think we have to remember that trade is mutually beneficial. There are great benefits here. So the supply chain diversity, the strategic movement, and then of course I think there's this emergency element as well, where in case of emergency break glass, we need proper stockpiles of things like PPE or certain drugs or whatever else. That isn't really a trade issue. It's just a systems issue that you have the supply, you have the wholesale capacity in case of emergency if you get cut off from certain places, or you have guaranteed supply from friendly countries. I think there's a lot of work we can do in Western countries to have guaranteed supply chains that don't necessarily need to involve blocking trade altogether.
Kristian, I want to come back to you. It's been suggested, I see on the YouTube chat, that you would actually have been praising Rishi Sunak to the rafters as a saint if he'd merely cut beer duty on every single beer except Doom Bar. But that wasn't the policy that he rolled out. But I was actually going to ask you, Kristian, on the immigration policy. Around the Brexit issue, you have expressed a lot of concern that Britain outside the EU might take a much stricter or more foolish approach to immigration. Do you think this issue with Hong Kong is actually showing that Britain, maybe by accident rather than by design, could end up with a relatively more liberal immigration policy than we had throughout our long membership of the European Union? Or am I being far too optimistic here again?
That could happen, but that is not because we ended free movement with the EU. That could have happened in any case. EU membership or single market membership never determined our immigration policies with regard to third countries. So what's happening now, for example, with regard to Hong Kong citizens, that could have happened in the EU. That could have happened under a softer Brexit scenario. That's just independent of that. And more generally, it is true that the new immigration system that's coming in next year is in some respects more liberal. There is going to be the overall cap on the number of visas for skilled people is going to be dropped. That's a good thing. And the salary threshold that migrants have to earn is going to be dropped. That's a good thing. But all of that could have happened while we were members of the single market as well. It's just independent of that. Now, the Hong Kong thing, that's clearly a good thing. I share the optimism. I would just add one little note of caution. It is the right thing to do. I would just not automatically assume that because Hong Kong is a liberal free market economy, that's something that's inherent in people who live in Hong Kong. Let's remember that they didn't choose these policies. That was more or less a coincidence. That was because they were ruled by a colonial administration of people who, as it happened, had read Adam Smith and thought, oh, this sounds pretty sensible. Let's try this. But I've seen some surveys from Hong Kong that showed that the thinking there doesn't seem to be particularly free market. And even if it is now, if once they've been here for 3 years or so, they will be as socialist as everyone else.
Okay, well, thanks. My panel's not doing a great job on cheering me up or raising my optimism ratings. So Duncan, let me come back to you. I asked some of our previous panelists earlier in the show what their ideal plans or policies were that the Chancellor of the Exchequer didn't roll out today, with a full budget coming up in not too many weeks or months' time. What have you guys at the TPA got in your top pocket that you think that Chancellor Sunak, again, I just love that name, it's just so Return of the Jedi, could actually stand up at the dispatch box at the time of his budget that he didn't roll out today but might roll out later in the year? What are your realistic hopes, Duncan?
Well, we would have liked to see much more done on national insurance. Obviously, this wasn't sort of a main budget event. We weren't necessarily expecting something like that. That can be done in numerous ways. It could either be an equalisation with the income tax threshold, so £12,500, or better still, we did some work on this last month, which would effectively introduce a holiday for both employer and employee national insurance. And one of the benefits of that would be that it would sort of circumvent some of the concerns which Kristian alluded to earlier, and that you're now picking favoured industries rather than the initial implementation of the furlough scheme, quite for the policies in March, apply to basically everything. So if you were to do that, then obviously that would incentivize basically all employers to either keep on staff and avoid this slightly dangerous bonus scheme to be paid at the end of this year and start of next year, as well as making it much easier to recruit staff if employers are encumbered with a pretty hefty national insurance bill. Now, I mean, the silver lining to this, of course, is that Chancellor Sunak did indeed increase the national insurance threshold, I think, to £9,500 in the budget back in March. So obviously this is something which has been, thought about and actually implemented very recently. Whether they actually go that far, we'll have to wait and see. But don't forget, of course, there's a spending review coming at the same time as or around about the same time as the budget after the autumn, in the autumn rather. So again, I mean, the government has made bad noises of no return to austerity, however poorly defined that might well have been. But I think there is a silver lining, and so we'll definitely be asking for some work on national insurance after the summer.
Okay, and we're going to bring in a couple of new guests just shortly, in which we might talk a bit more about the fundamental institutions of a free society rather than just the economic side of it. But before I let Jamie and Matt go, I want your overall wrap up. As you know, every week there is the highly market sensitive Live with Littlewood economic optimism barometer. The question you have to ask yourself, Jamie and Matt, is on a score of 0 to 10, how optimistic are you that in 2 to 3 years' time, Britain will be a thriving, growing, prosperous, free economy, where 10 is, I was going to say Singapore on steroids, but actually Singapore has quite a lot of areas with a lot to be desired, but a free market, very free market outcome, and 0 is North Korea. Matt, let me start with you. What's your optimism rating? You've basically been a pretty chirpy chappy on previous episodes of this show. Are you keeping your chin up?
Every time I come on, I forget what my previous rating is, so they're probably going to be extremely inconsistent. But I'm feeling about a 7 today, and I say that not necessarily because I have that much confidence in this government. In fact, over time, I find myself increasingly disappointed and more Kristian Niemietz-like in my disposition.
Don't go there.
It's a dark place, I imagine. But the reason why I am a little more optimistic is because perhaps unlike Kristian, I have a broader faith in people's capacity to, despite government, try to be innovative and entrepreneurial. We've got a very dark position in the economy right now, but at the same time, recessions are often the best times to start up businesses, to try new things. It's a difficult time, but it's a time that you can then get regrowth and rebuilding of an economy. And I think that's what's going to define the prosperity in the future, not necessarily what the government decides to do with a specific tax rate tomorrow, but rather than how the people respond to the difficult situation we're now in.
Great. Well, a 7. Okay, that's pretty good. I think that's been roughly your number. A kind of measured optimism has been pretty much your consistent
rational
analysis.
optimism in a Ridley sense.
I mean, I see. God damn! The people joining us on live chat and YouTube seem to be a couple of zeros in there. You're not that miserable, are you, Jamie? Tell us what's your number for the Live with Littlewood economic optimism barometer on a scale of 0 to 10, Jamie.
Well, I agree with Matthew, or perhaps I should follow the Niemietz tradition and call him Lesh. I agree with Lesh that people are pretty dynamic, and especially in London, let's say, you got a very entrepreneurial kind of set of people, and they'll do stuff, yes, but not a 7, 4, let's say. And the reason I'm pessimistic is that there's just been a complete acceptance on part of the government that it's this conservative government, that it is the job of the government to administer the economy, that they should decide which sectors get how many resources and what's that they should keep people safe, that businesses shouldn't go broke just because bad stuff happens, and all these ideas have taken on that are they're the opposite of the ideas that we all share here, and I'm that makes me pessimistic. And the deal they did to get elected, the way, it's the kind of Steve Davis analysis of where they had to move on economics in order to pick up the votes that they got from Labour. It just means they made a big, I think, move to the left on economics that's going to be around for quite a while. And, we guys don't think that works. So I'm pessimistic. I'll say 4. 4 is I might say 3, but I'm trying to be nice. So I'll say 4. Okay,
well, that's cheered me up just a little. Jamie, just before I do let you go, what's your prescription there? I mean, for those who've been downcast about, sort of free markets are not mentioned anymore, or oftentimes when they are by politicians who you might consider of a free market bent, they tend to start sentences with, I'm a free marketeer, but and then list a whole load of interventionist, high tax, central planning interventions. What am I doing wrong at the IEA? Why the hell aren't we winning? I mean, it's so completely transparently obvious and rational that people of a free market persuasion are right. The jury's in. What do I need to do differently, my friend?
Well, when I was at the IEA, I was on a panel at the Tory Party conference back then, the one where May was Prime Minister and the sign fell down, that one. And one of the panel discussions was, how do we make the case for free markets? And I gave this answer, which was that it's to point out how stupid and incompetent the people in government trying to do a better job than the market are. So, these are it's not the government, right? It's people. They are particular people, and they're a bunch of fools. They're corrupt. They don't know anything. They're taking on powers they've got no right. They're presumptuous. Look how they've ballsed up the management of this crisis, right? It's to go for them to say they're pretending to a competence they don't have, and just attack them the whole time on that ground. That's my recommendation, because you can't do it with abstract ideas. You can't do it with Hayek and Adam Smith.
We need to be the anti-elite, anti-establishment force for change.
Yeah.
Jamie, Matt, great to have you with us. Thank you very much for your time. Kristian and Duncan, please stay with us. Matt and Jamie, enjoy the rest of your evening. Been a real pleasure having you. See you both again soon. Now, delighted for the final segment of the show, where we're going to have a bit of a change of topic, to welcome back to the programme Claire Fox of the Institute of Ideas. It's wonderful to have Claire with us. Good evening to you, Claire. And also joined by Silkie Carlo, the director of Big Brother Watch. Full disclosure, I'm a director of Big Brother Watch, so I'm not entirely sure, Silkie, whether you're appearing here out of choice or out of obligation, but it's wonderful to have you on the show as well. I want to, for the last part of the programme, move away from economics, because although we're the Institute of Economic Affairs and talk about economics a lot, our mission statement's also about the fundamental institutions of a free society, that a free economy can really only work if there's free exchange of ideas, freedom of speech and all the rest of it. And Claire, good evening to you. I'd like to start with you and your analysis of where we've got to in terms of the state of public discourse. We discussed this on this show last week. I was tearing my hair out that public discourse was just becoming ridiculous, was all about virtue signalling, no matters of substance. And I'd like you to talk us through your Don't Divide Us initiative. What's your analysis of the problem that we've got into with all of these recent sort of Black Lives Matter, cancel culture and all the rest of it? And Claire, tell us what your prescription and remedy is, and a very good evening to you. It's lovely to have you back.
It's good to be here. Thanks. I suppose the key point is that a key thing has happened, which is the identity politics, which has riven universities and certain sections of society apart, in which you are to be known by your immutable characteristics, your skin color, your gender, whatever, have exploded into public life and have really subsumed. What's more is subsumed even the corporate sector, business sector, the establishment, and so on and so forth. And the problem with this issue is that, having had a spontaneous outrage over the brutal killing of one man in America, is now turned into a full-blown shake-up of society, in which if you don't go along with a particular narrative, you are deemed to be a bigot. And the mainstreaming of things like white privilege, white fragility, white supremacy, these kind of ideas, emphasizes one's skin color. And in fact, it's now become fashionable in those circles to say that if you go along with the Martin Luther King analysis in the famous I Had a Dream speech, which is the dream is that you're judged by your character, not your skin color, that is now seen to be an act of unconscious bias and covering up racism. That, in fact, we need to emphasize that. So the Don't Divide Us initiative, if you want, it was a forlorn attempt, but it's actually been quite positive, to say, actually, we shouldn't allow them to fragment us in this way, because the impact on free speech is such that if you can't query the narrative without being cancelled or delegitimized as a bigot, it means you can't even talk about this issue. And there's been a lot of emphasis on Black Lives Matter as a Marxist organization, anti-capitalist. I mean, God, as an old Marxist, I wish they bloody were, but they're undoubtedly, they've got a hodgepodge, but it's not Black Lives Matters that are the problem. They're just an organization. Nobody needs to take any notice of them. It's the fact that everybody in the corporate world has given them money, is that everyone in the establishment is bending the knee, if not literally, certainly metaphorically. And that this is leading to a situation where undoubtedly some rather unsavory white separatists are taking advantage. And if ordinary people, millions of them, are told that if they don't go along with Black Lives Matters or unconscious bias analysis, that they must be a racist, they're going to start saying, well, God, what's wrong with being white? So the Don't Divide Us was an attempt at getting a rank and file group across politics, across ages, and I think there was 37 people. We didn't go for big names particularly, to just say, this is what's happening and we shouldn't be divided by this. We have to transcend our skin color, our ethnicity, and we have to do something to take on the cancel culture. The only other thing just to say is, I think what's just happened in America in the last 24 hours is just absolutely extraordinary. They went in America, a bunch of 150 very quite well-known figures wrote a signed letter in Harper's, which was a kind of nicely worded free speech letter. The kind of letter that, it's a bit overly liberal for me, if you want, a bit sort of soft, but it was fine. And it was an attempt, again, like Don't Divide Us, to say, we should be listening to each other and tolerant and, asserting some liberal views. Anyway, this was greeted as a great step forward because it was, again, across left and right. Anyway, within about 3 hours of it being published, half the people on it were cancelled for signing it. A range of people were trying to be cancelled because they signed the same, because J.K. Rowling signed, so they must be transphobic if you're on the same letter. In fact, the letter about challenging cancel culture is being cancelled as we speak. A number of signatories have stood down. And you do think, my God, this really is one of those the world has gone mad situations. So I think people who think it's a glib story, that it's just a studentish story, that the statue's toppling is not to be worried about, I think that they underestimate what is a profound shake-up of liberty and free society. And I think we are less free as we speak as a consequence.
I'll come to Silkie in a moment, but Claire, I just want to follow up on that letter, because you've given a useful update there. But I must admit, when I saw this, I'm just looking at on my screen now the BBC coverage from 7 hours ago. When I looked this up this morning, I sort of punched the air, because I thought, actually, this is a really diverse range of folk. I don't give a damn about their diversity in terms of their gender or their religion or their race, but I was going to get J.K. Rowling, Noam Chomsky, Gary Kasparov, Malcolm Gladwell. I mean, this is quite a coalition of very, very disparate people. And I was noticing already, I've only just looked at the update now, that some of this was falling away. But even if half of it's fallen away, don't you think that it's pretty good news that, there's only 75 of the 150 left standing, but this actually did seem to me to be a pretty serious beginning of a fight back from a pretty disparate bunch of folk who just said, look, come on, free speech really does matter. And it wasn't obviously a segment of people only from the right or only from the left or only poets or only filmmakers. A really impressive coalition, no?
Absolutely. I mean, I was excited too. It was just one of those things where I was excited. And then just before I went to bed last night, I started to notice that I got this morning, though, chaos reigns. And actually the signatories that have signed, it's just that they're now under a huge amount of pressure. And I hope that they will stick with it. I didn't mean to make that sound so gloomy. I was more in showing that it's a sign of the times that very valiant attempt at fight back itself became a matter of great contrast, is at the moment in the middle of a storm, and that therefore anyone who signed it, their own tribes, as it were, for want of a better description, are putting them under pressure. So people are saying, well, why are you signing with Barry Wise on it? You know, or what, whoever you don't like on it. And this is also a guilt by association, which we've also had a lot of. This, you know, I mean, you sign a letter because you agree with the letter. You don't ask who else is signing in case it's people you don't like. The whole point about free speech is you say, we give free speech to everyone despite everything. But we know that that's not the way it plays out. And therefore I was indicating, and I follow a number of the signatories, and I understand this, they're being rather defensive. I mean, you know, you can see they're trying to fight back, and yet some of them, and certainly the lesser known academics that signed it, particularly on the left, actually, a number of them have pulled out. They're under too much pressure. They can't cope with the stress. I mean, if you're Noam Chomsky, you're probably all right. And if you're J.K. Rowling, you're probably all right. But I think the general mood at the moment is, unless you're famous with a huge following and money, and it doesn't matter whether you're absolutely humiliated, shamed and named and called a bigot, you could lose your job. I mean, there's a genuine McCarthyite atmosphere. And I think that, you know, the thing that we have to, or certainly the IEA has to think about this. I mean, you were just talking about entrepreneurs and free society and all the rest of it. You have got us into a situation where bosses are telling people who work for them that they've got to have a black square around their Instagram picture. Employers are threatening staff that they've got to go on unconscious bias training. I just met somebody from, I mean, actually it's from, you know, from one of the, I think it's the nuclear industry, but one of the industries that you would not think was the most PC woke industry. They've mandated their staff to go on an unconscious bias training. And when somebody objected to that, they were told in no uncertain terms that this was not an option. Now that is the, and actually by querying it, it indicated that they had unconscious bias. So in other words, if you don't go along with the narrative, you are deeming yourself to be a bigot. And I just think that we have to recognize that if you're Joe Bloggs, Mrs. Smith, you look on this and you're scared. You realize you're being told to shut up and put up. And if we thought that people felt left behind before they had a chance to express their views in the Brexit referendum, if you're going to treat the majority of people in this country as though they're inherently racist just because they happen to be born with a particular skin colour, we're in trouble.
Claire, thank you. Silkie, let me come to you. Lovely to have you on the show for the first time, Silkie. And as I said, I'm a director of Big Brother Watch. So in addition to making sure if you're watching that you donate to the IEA, please go to the Big Brother Watch website, sign up for their materials, and also make a donation to them. Absolutely fantastic organisation that's led by Silkie. And Silkie, I wanted your thoughts on this kind of rise of McCarthyism. I read through a lot of your tweets. I particularly liked what you said about Prince Harry. Unconscious bias. Prince Harry could spare us this claptrap lecture and excruciating faux fist pounding, resign himself, and if he's going to call for anything, call for a republic. What do you make of this unbelievable, as Claire was saying, kind of McCarthyite approach, not just in terms of, you know, regulations, it might not even be the state, but actually in terms of corporate culture increasingly cancelling things, that it's quite a challenge for the IEA that I think Claire's sort of set up, but it seems to be a cultural phenomenon. You know, I can't point at a particular law and say we need to kind of repeal that and everybody will be able to express themselves freely. It seems that it's very, very hard now to have free discourse, and there's an awful lot of discrimination. No, Silkie?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I diagnosed the problem maybe slightly differently to Claire in some respects. I mean, I think there's a long overdue shake-up, and a shake-up is a good thing. And there are lots of deep-seated problems in society that are coming to the fore and that are hopefully going to be sorted out and that need to be sorted out. And I don't think it's movements like Black Lives Matter that are pressuring people to go on unconscious bias courses and this kind of stuff. What they are focusing on is conscious bias. It's police racism, brutality, murders, really serious problems. And I think, ironically, it's probably white liberals who are virtue signalling and acting in this kind of performative way, which is it definitely seems to be catalyzed by ideas like white fragility and a kind of original sin theory of racism, that people seem to feel they have to performatively repent. And I do think, and where I think I agree with Claire, is that becomes then, it's kind of actually reinforcing a lot of division. But I think the censoriousness is coming from a more corporate culture, an aversion to risk, and again, this kind of like performative view around discourse, which I think comes from social media. Twitter completely reinforces vitriol, hatred, call outs. It's kind of like sassy way of engaging with people, to put it lightly. And it does not in any respect kind of rewards like learning from each other or disagreeing, just actually disagreeing. We've all got something to learn from each other. The fact that discourse is in such a vitriolic place is disappointing. And yeah, I mean, like Claire said, the response to the Harper's letter, which could not have been a more vanilla, anodyne argument for better discourse, open debate and free speech, that it's become this kind of vortex of call out and cancellations is a perfect representation of the problem in so many ways.
No, I think that's so right. I mean, I haven't obviously gone through all the metrics, but it's a rarity indeed that you get involved in a Twitter spat that ends up with somebody tweeting saying, actually, fair point, I've never really considered that. I hadn't really looked at it from that side of the equation. Nobody ever says that. It's just not configured in that way. But Silkie, what's your kind of thought on what's the remedy for this? Tell us a little bit about what Big Brother Watch has been doing, particularly over the course of the lockdown, the concerns that you've raised about civil liberties specifically being clamped down on in recent weeks or months. But what's the solution to this? How do we try and get back somewhere to a free, expressive society in which, matters of substantive disagreement can be considered to be taken by people in good faith and with sincerity?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to just say quickly then about the free speech work that we've been doing. We've actually been working on a report for almost 2 years on online censorship. And it was nearing completion when coronavirus happened. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to do with that yet. I'm just going to make a small point quickly about free speech campaigning in the UK. There's no funding for it. And this is a really critical problem. And I really loathe to talk about NGO funding. It's like a really boring thing to talk about, but it just has to be said, because if people want to understand why the discourse in this country around free speech is so skewed, it's because all of the funding that goes into organizations that typically protect freedom of expression is geared around misinformation and disinformation and actually putting in controls around online censorship, safetyism, etc. There is no kind of institutional support for actually just free speech. So that's a major problem, and that's something we're currently struggling with as well. The bigger picture on civil liberties at the moment in the UK, if it's optimism you were after, I was the wrong person for you to speak to, because it's not good. I mean, it's currently, okay, so today it's a criminal offence to go on a protest. It's unheard of in this country that you can be criminalized for going on a demonstration. You can go and work on a construction site, you can go to restaurants, etc., but you cannot go on a demonstration. And this is the kind of overhang of the lockdown regulations, that the lockdown from day one has never ever been in place with parliamentary approval. Parliament has been swerved at every single turn. You've now got parliamentarians talking about Parliament being used as a rubber stamping exercise. It's been made a mockery of, and this is completely true. And you kind of have to pinch yourself that we found ourselves in this situation. I've been wondering, is this how all autocracies start? Is with the sense that it's for the greater good, and well, it's okay because we're us and we'll be safe. We have now slipped into autocratic rule under Matt Hancock mostly, which is pretty weird. Then you've got obviously extremely oppressive legislation, very far reaching, like the Coronavirus Act, we pushed for a review of every prosecution under the Act. 100% of the prosecutions under the Coronavirus Act have been unlawful. 20,000 fines have been issued to people during lockdown for breaching lockdown. A huge portion of those will be unlawful, and for all sorts of things. We've been charting the policing that's gone on in the last few months. We've seen things like people being told to go home for doing the wrong type of exercise, people being told off because they're out for a walk wearing jeans, which suggests they're not doing exercise, people going out to the supermarket to get something that's non-essential because it's like a dessert or wine. Some truly nuts stuff. Disproportionate amount of the fines have gone to people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. It's a similar kind of story. I think we've dug into a really bad place with oppressive policing in the country. Where do we go from here? We're doing monthly reports to Parliament and trying to stir up some pushback in Parliament, because that's desperately needed. You know, like I said, the fact that this has never had the biggest loss of liberty, the hugest suspension of human rights for decades and decades, and there's still no kind of parliamentary oversight or scrutiny of it. So we're trying to increase that through doing monthly reports, which people can find on our website. If you want a rundown of what the hell just happened in the last 3 months, we've got a video called 100 Days of Lockdown in the UK, which you can find on YouTube. We fought really hard for we fought really hard for an amendment to the Coronavirus Act to allow Parliament to vote on it sooner, because unfortunately it's designed to basically stay in place for 2.5 years or longer. So there will now be a vote in September on the Coronavirus Act. I would just say we've got to stay terribly vigilant about this, because there's been a massive coup, a huge swing towards executive power. It's gone quite badly so far, and it looks set to only get worse.
Kristian, I want to come back to you before I bring Claire and Duncan back in. I mean, Kristian's one of our best Twitter warriors here at the IA. He just understands how Twitter works. He uses it brilliantly. I find it very difficult to use it brilliantly. I don't have Kristian's famous dry Germanic wit, and I tend to just sort of lose my temper on it. So Kristian puts out all these just brilliant tweets that just make you raise like half an eyebrow and chuckle. But Kristian, my wider point was, although you're brilliant at that, and it drives a lot of traffic to the IA's sort of website, and then people engage in the arguments, what do you make of the state of public discourse at the moment, Kristian? I mean, is it just kind of one side against the other? Are Claire and Silkie's points valid, that and my concerns that sort of substance has just disappeared? Everything is just about symbolism and virtue signalling. Do you share that concern as such a brilliant Twitter warrior?
I absolutely do, yes. And I think there's a reason for that. That's simply what happens when one side completely wins the argument, which is the progressive left, the woke left, whatever you want to call it, has won the argument. They don't have an obvious enemy, but they nonetheless cannot give up. They want to keep fighting for the sake of it, and that's why you get all this signaling. Claire said that we talk too much about economics, not enough about the cultural issues, but I actually think you can explain the culture war with economic terminology. I think woke opinions have become a status symbol, a modern status symbol, in the way that maybe a generation ago a Rolex watch would have been a status symbol. Nowadays, people signal their social status by showing how woke they are. Now, there is a difference between this kind of status signaling competition and the earlier ones, which is that it's actually pretty hard to get a Rolex watch or any of the earlier status symbols, whereas expressing a woke opinion is very cheap and easy. I mean, anyone can follow the right accounts on Twitter and cheer them on. And that's how these opinions quickly become mainstream. But once everyone expresses the fashionable opinion of the day, it is no longer a marker of distinction. And if you still want to stand out, you have to become more extreme. if everyone endorses Black Lives Matter, then that's just a mainstream cause, and you have to go one step higher if you still want to stand out. And I think that's what's happening. It's an arms race, and it's escalating. And that's where this cancel culture comes from. It's no longer enough to just say, I strongly disagree with the speaker, I'm boycotting their speech, or I'm not going to buy their book or whatever. No, you have to go more extreme. You have to say, I'm so appalled by this person, I want them out of public life altogether. And that's what's happening here. The letter that Claire mentioned, I've read it as well, and if anything, I thought it was far too tame. There was far too much both sidesism in it. It started distancing itself from the populist right. Well, at least in Britain, this isn't really true. It isn't the woke left versus the populist right. When was the last time that the populist right, whoever that is, cancelled someone? When was the last time they got someone fired? This is one side doing this. They have completely won. They don't have an opponent, but they cannot give up.
Claire, let me come back to you before I bring Duncan in. Kristian sort of says, is there this sort of, I don't know how to badge them, a kind of woke progressive, although I think that's a misuse of the strict meaning of the word. They're not really in favour of progress, interventionist, virtue signalling bunch of folk who have won the argument, or as I've just seen somebody point out on the live chat on Twitter, it's maybe they haven't won the argument, they're simply succeeding in imposing their ideology on others by force. Do you share Kristian's view that that's what's happened, or do you think, not just the Harper's letter, but you yourself, Claire, were a Brexit Party MEP, I mean, on a very different issue. I'm not relating that to Black Lives Matter or anything, but it seems to me, actually, although they may not get the airtime and the headlines and the media coverage, that there's boiling under quite a public potential backlash of what you might call ordinary folk, be those folk who voted for the Brexit Party or voted against progressive left parties at the last election. Where do you think we stand on the balance of power and who's winning the argument, Claire?
Yeah, well, I definitely think that our side are winning the argument. And to Silkie's point earlier, which I think relates, it's not that there is no problem of racism in this country. I don't think it's as, I don't think those people who say that, there's a straight line from slavery to racism and that nothing has improved or changed, or that there's no distinction between the UK and America in terms of their criminal justice system. That's all nonsense. But of course, there's discrimination. But when I say, of course, I think there is discrimination. But you have to be specific about it. To simply say the presence of white people at the same time as the presence of black people in a country means there's racism is to indict everybody. And that's where the backlash comes in. But by the way, it's not just a backlash of white people, although the emphasis that one side is putting on black lives versus white lives over racializes it. But of course, many people from ethnic minorities hate the fact that they're called BAME, POC, lumped in some indistinguishable blob as though they've all got the same views. And it's not even a question of whether there's Tory people of color. Of course there are, but it's that anyone would think that anyone, just because of the color of their skin, would have a view. It's a ridiculously insulting notion. And so consequently, I think there is a brewing resentment, but there's no obvious place to express it. That's the problem with the free speech issue. And how it relates to the lockdown is that if you consider the people calling for the lockdown, I mean, I remember, Owen Jones saying, I never thought I'd welcome a police state locking us up, a Tory government locking us in, and thank God for that. And people like Paul Mason demanding the lockdown. The reason I say that is because I was shocked at how easily the left were prepared to go along with the lack of freedom or the taking of civil liberties. Silkie's absolutely right. I mean, it was just incredible. This bill comes in and it's basically silence from usual civil libertarians. So you realize that even when people say they believe in a free society, that there was, from my side, I consider myself on the left, my side on the left, there was this sort of very thin commitment to freedom, such that they just didn't bother to fight for it. And it's not surprising in that context where you've just allowed the state to take away your freedoms without being able to scrutinize. I mean, I said there should be a sunset clause, and people kept saying to me, You want old people to die. You're murdering people. You know, dissent speech went from being unsafe or triggering from a university context to, if you allow dissenting views to be heard, you will kill people in the middle of a pandemic, which was obviously the scariest thing. It's no surprise then, with that broad atmosphere, that then when something as woke as issues around racial discrimination and so on come in, that people would get frightened and silenced. But under the surface, there is great dissatisfaction, resentment, call it what you want. When we brought out Don't Divide Us, what was fantastic was it's not an initiative. There's definitely no money. It was just, honestly, let's do a statement and see what happens. We'd been overwhelmed by people contacting us positively saying, thank God, because I was really worried that I was going to get forced into some sort of, you know, like the only people locally were saying it were Tommy Robinson or whatever. So I think the positive thing is that people want this, but they are the rank and file, and no one in leadership is saying it. That's the danger.
Duncan, you've been very patient. Sorry, let me come back to you before I ask each of our panelists for their final thoughts. All of us involved in the think tank business, the battle of ideas, call it what you will, you know, need freedom of speech and expression, and especially if you're trying to put forward ideas of substance. I say that objectively. I'm not, I'm not trying to suggest that everybody who appears on this channel has ideas of substance and people who don't. But if you're trying to actually get into a proper debate and discussion, this prevailing culture and cancel culture and having to second guess whether what you say might offend somebody, I mean, it's potentially the death of us, isn't it?
Well, I don't think I'm going to change my behavior in speaking out, and I think that probably applies to basically all of us. But I think the concern for me is that if we look at legislation, so I think it's the Companies Act 2006, and within that contains requirements for certain listed basically larger companies, big listed firms, to undertake corporate social responsibility. So if you look through the accounts of most FTSE 100 firms, there'll be some entry which defines, you know, we've done certain charitable do-goodery. And my concern would be that, you know, there will be an extension of that to incorporate, you know, be it unconscious bias training or whatever kind of, you know, slightly odd, pernicious scheme that comes out from that. And so, you know, in as much as quite a few firms are sort of going through the motions of, you know, doing supportive tweets and doing a black box for the Instagram accounts and so on and so forth, I'd be worried if there'd be a push to change that. I don't think that's likely at the moment, but I think that's certainly plausible. And you know, at that stage, it then becomes very, very, very dangerous for, you know, quite a few of us advocates for this. If it isn't going to be the case that quite a few of the larger companies and better capitalists are in fact being sort of browbeaten into doing some of this, not just through, you know, open media pressure, but through a legal change as well at some stage. So I think that's something quite we should be careful of in the next few years.
Silkie, let me come back to you, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to wrap up their final thoughts. I mean, do you think, Silkie, is kind of identity politics is just culturally clamping down on individual free expression? You know, you're a white woman, I'm a white man, you know, whatever, and we're all defined in these particular boxes. And if we allow identity politics to continue to run in this fashion, then you know, individual free expression is going to suffer. And I obviously have to ask each of you for your Live with Littlewood optimism barometer. How free a society do you think Britain will be in 2 to 3 years' time? So, Silkie, can you tackle those two things for me? Finish with your optimism rating, but start with, is identity politics the antithesis of individual expression?
I think identity politics is a cul-de-sac that takes people who are interested in coming together and changing things nowhere. It seems to have, you know, taking an evidence-based approach, it seems to really be leading nowhere except fulfilling the theory of divide and conquer. And as activists, I've been a campaigner my whole life. The key is to convince people who disagree with you as to how you can convince them of your point of view and how you can relate to them as human beings. And it seems that is now an old-fashioned idea that's gone out of the window, that has no respect, because in its place is now this idea that we have to ostracize people. And frankly, that's bullshit, and it's going to get people absolutely nowhere. Turning to my optimism rating, well, you can see from my t-shirt, I've diagnosed 2020 as the new 1984. My optimism levels are very low, but I am putting my faith in people. And I still think at this stage, everything still hangs in the balance. So we have an opportunity now to try and make things better. If anyone who cares about these kinds of issues gets involved in these debates, whether it's here, joining Big Brother Watch, taking part in things and actually being part of this process, writing to their MPs, etc., then I think we'll get somewhere. So I'm going to sort of sit on the fence, maybe like I was going to say 5, but I'm going to say 4. But that really relies on my faith in the British people, that we're going to actually get ourselves together and try to claw back all the liberties that we've lost.
1984 wasn't such a bad year. Southampton came second in the Premier Division that year. I don't know what you're all complaining about. Claire, how are you feeling about, I guess it's not the long term, 2 or 3 years hence, doughty campaigners who've been around the block endless times like you and I, sometimes focus, on the immediate challenges. Obviously we have to, but thinking 2 or 3 years ahead, where are you on the optimism rating? We're having a pretty bleak set of numbers so far today.
Yeah, I'm slightly more optimistic, but it requires a fight. We haven't mentioned, I think it's worth mentioning the David Starkey incident, only in as much as this. I watched that film before he was cancelled, and as I watched it, I hated it. I've known David Starkey, and I thought, my God, this is racist crap. But I think that there should be a debate about that. The speed with which he was cancelled and the whole thing spiraled out of control. So don't get me wrong. What he said I thought was reprehensible, historically illiterate and insulting. But I don't think that I don't want to hear that. I think I want to row with him. Mm-hmm. And what my optimism is that so many people contacted me to ask me what I thought about the Starkey thing that didn't want to cancel him, but wanted to try and understand it. And I think therefore with a fight in my hands, but because I believe people don't want to be bigots and do want freedom, I'm going to go for 6, because I'm going to make sure 6 or 7 is, I'm going to make sure it happens. That's it.
6 or 7. We need an integer from you, Claire. Pick one.
Yes, 6. I'm sorry.
6 it is. Okay. Duncan, let me go to you, and then I'll give the last words to Herr Niemietz, if it's not racist to call him Herr Niemietz. Duncan, give us your optimism rating, scale of 1 to 10.
I'm afraid it's all looking pretty bleak. I think I'll probably go for a 3, and I think that for a couple of reasons. Kind of alluding to what some of the points which Jamie was making earlier. I think we need to sort of shout from the rooftops and call out far too many members of the government for what they're doing. I think the council culture, I don't see that ending anytime soon. We'll keep doing what we're doing, but in terms of where the country will be in 2 to 3 years' time, be it through suffocating through debt or statutory changes to limit how companies can operate and talk and interact with their customers, I'd be very nervous about that. So I'm afraid it's not uplifting, it's going to have to be a 3.
Kristian, I need to go to you. I'm relying on your Germanic optimism to try and boost these pitiful aggregate numbers. Give us your number for the Live with Littlewood Optimism Index, Kristian.
I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place. It's got to be a 3 as well. On the cancel culture, yes, it's absolutely not going to go away. I keep hearing the argument that there is a silent majority which is opposed to all this. Well, yes, that may be so. If we have, for example, a referendum, and the question being, do you think we should remove old statues in the country? Or do you think we should remove every TV show that says an unwoke word? Then, of course, the woke side would not win that referendum. And if it comes to crude numbers, then yes, I agree, a majority would not go along with it. But there is a reason why the silent majority is called the silent majority, and that is it's going to stay silent. You can't rely on the average Joe who wants a quiet life, who doesn't want any trouble, to storm the barricades on this. Most people will probably just watch this and prefer not to get involved, even if they secretly disagree. It is often the case that political debates are driven by the ones who are most vociferous, who care most about it, who are most outspoken. And the culture war issues are definitely like that. So therefore, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about 10% of the population or 20% or even just 5%, as long as these are the most vocal and outspoken ones and the most aggressive ones, which the woke culture warrior certainly is, that can be absolutely more than enough to keep dominating the debate. So therefore, I can't bring myself to go above 3. And on the economic side, well, I mean, there even the silent majority is on the wrong side. So there, it's I'm afraid it's looking even worse.
Well, blimey, the guests on tonight's show haven't cheered me up that much. Listen, I'm going to try and boost the average a bit. I'm going to go for an 8. An 8, that's my level of optimism. But that's largely based on Southampton successfully beating Manchester City 1-0 on Sunday evening and thereby securing our Premier League future. So Rishi Sunak, also a Southampton fan, had a similarly good week to me on that regard. Whether you think he's had a good week with regard to his statement, I'll let you decide that. Thanks to all of you who followed us on YouTube. By far the best way to signal your virtue is to subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Go to the iea.org.uk website where you can sign up to our daily newsletter for free or make a donation. Thanks to our previous guests, Isabel, Andrew, Jamie and Matt. My sincere thanks to my 4 latter guests, Kristian, Duncan, Claire and Silkie. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this discussion with you. We look forward to welcoming you all back soon. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks for watching. We'll be back at 6 p.m. next Wednesday for the next episode of Live with Littlewood. Until then, despite our 4.6 recurring optimism rating, try and keep your chin up and enjoy the rest of your evening. Over and out.